let's have a look at this situation for a moment. On the one hand, who do I mean by the affluent here? Well, I mean people who have enough income or enough wealth so that they can meet all of their needs for food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, if they have children, to educate their children, and make reasonable provision for the future. Things could always go wrong. You could always lose your job. Maybe you work for the US government and it might be shut down. So you want to make some provision for the future as well. But even after you've done that, you still have enough to spend on things that by no stretch of the imagination are really needs. And that's a huge range of things. At the one end, it can be things that are expensive, big ticket items. Might be taking an expensive vacation abroad. And at the other end, it might be quite small things individually that nevertheless add up over the year. Think, for example, how much do you spend on buying things to drink? Well, since the water that comes out of the tap here is safe to drink, even if it's not the most delicious water in the country, but it's safe to drink, so really everything that you spend on something to drink is a luxury. It's not a necessity, and that's whether it ranges from bottled water to sodas to coffees. Well, you might think you need some coffee to get through the night to get your paper done because you left it too late, but generally speaking, this is not a need either. And so all of those things are things that we can do without if we want to. They're optional expenditures for us. And then, of course, in between, there's things like clothes, when our clothes have not worn out, but we're just tired of them, and going to concerts or whatever that might be. All of those things are things that couldn't really be regarded as necessities. So I assume that we're all in that situation. We're all spending money on things that are not necessities. And that puts us in what I'm going to refer to as the affluent class. And I'm speaking globally here. So globally, there's more than 1 billion people who are like us in that respect, who are affluent. Maybe it's 1.5 billion, something in that order. And then, if we look at the other end of the spectrum, the World Bank says that there are over 1 billion people who live in extreme poverty. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as not having enough to reliably meet your basic needs. So not enough income to reliably meet those needs that I mentioned. You may not reliably have enough food for yourself and your family. You may not have enough to send your children even to complete primary school. You may have nothing that you can spend on healthcare and no access to free healthcare. You're unlikely to have safe drinking water in your home. You may not have even sanitation in your home. So a lot of basic necessities are missing, and the World Bank says that currently calculates that level of income that you can meet those necessities by a rather complicated formula, which you might see stated as the purchasing power equivalent of $1.25 US per day. So that needs a little bit of explanation. Firstly, what we're talking about is not what $1.25 US would buy if you went to that country and you gave it to a bank and you said, give me local currency for this. Because if you've travelled in developing countries, you will know that your US dollars go quite far. They go much further than they do in this country. Prices are low once you convert at the rates of foreign exchange. But the World Bank says purchasing power equivalent. So it's not talking about that. It's talking about how much $1.25 US buys in this country, and the equivalent amount in the foreign currency, in the currency where people live in the developing world, that buys the equivalent of what $1.25 buys in this country. So it's much less than $1.25 at foreign exchange equivalents. On the other hand, it's also true that the World Bank is talking in 1993 dollars. So that makes a variant in the other direction, because of course we've had significant inflation since 1993. Perhaps $1.25 in 1993 dollars may be worth something around $2 today. So you could think of this as the purchasing power equivalent in these countries of $2 US per day, what you can get for $2 today. But it's obvious still, firstly, that it's very little, and secondly, that the discrepancy between our income and theirs is huge. And this makes a difference in terms of how much the relatively small amounts that I mentioned that we might spend on things we don't need, how much difference they could make to people elsewhere. Because the cost of that latte, perhaps, that you're buying on Nassau Street might be more than the daily income of people living in extreme poverty. So something that to you is fairly minor is more than they have, perhaps even than the whole family has if there's only one breadwinner to live on for a day. So there's a very big difference. And the next question is, what does that difference actually mean in terms of these people's lives? Well, it means, obviously, that they can't take for granted the things that we have, that if they become ill or their children become ill, they may not be able to get any health care, that they may not be able to send their children to school, that they may be hungry, or there may be times of the year in which they're hungry. They may not be hungry all year round, but there may be a time of the year when they're waiting for the next harvest to come in, when they're short of food, they have to cut down on food, they go to bed hungry. It means that their life expectancy is much less than ours. So whereas ours is now in the high 70s or around 80, depending whether you're male or female, in many developing countries it's around 50. So there's a big difference in how long people live. And that's particularly reflected in the rate of child mortality. So UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Foundation, recently published, just last month, published its report on child mortality in the year 2012. Child mortality means children who die before their 5th birthday. It said that 6.6 million children died in the world before they reached their 5th birthday in 2012, and it said that this is good news. Why is it good news? It's good news because the number has been falling year after year since the 1990s. And this 6.6 million is again down on the previous year when it was 6.9 million. So it's a significant drop. And if you look back to 1990, child mortality was then estimated at 12 million. So considering that the world's population has increased quite dramatically since 1990, the proportion of children under 5 dying has fallen even further than the difference between 12 and 6.6, which is already close to a 50% decline. And obviously as a proportion, it's declined more than that. So that is good news. But it still means that 6.6 million children are dying, and they're not dying because they contract some strange disease that we don't know how to cure. They're dying from quite simple diseases, for example, from diarrhea, which we can prevent if we can provide safe drinking water, and when it does occur, we can very easily and cheaply cure by a simple mixture of salts and water called oral rehydration therapy. But you have to get this to all of the rural villages where these deaths occur, and you have to educate people on how to use it. So it takes a bit of effort. These children also die from measles because still not all children are being immunized against measles, although one of the big factors in why child deaths have been dropping is the campaign to immunise children against measles and other childhood diseases. So that's making progress, but not fast enough. And they die from malaria, which we can also prevent by providing bed nets. And again, we have had success in reducing the number of children dying from malaria because of efforts to distribute bed nets, but there are still children dying from malaria. So while we're making progress, 6.6 million children dying from preventable causes is surely far too many. If you think of it, because that's a very big figure, you think of it on a daily basis, it's 18,000 children dying every day. Imagine that all those children were over there in the Princeton Stadium. They wouldn't quite fill it. I think the capacity is a little more than that, but they would come pretty close to filling it. Imagine that, and imagine that for some reason, unless people helped them, unless people gave them support, they would all die by midnight. Well, obviously that would be a major news story of the day, and everybody, or huge numbers of people would rush to provide assistance to them, and those deaths would be averted. I think we can be quite confident about that. But the facts that I've just been giving you are not major news headlines. Even the UNICEF report barely made the news. You had to look quite hard to find a news item about it. And that's just something that happens one day each year when they release that report for the previous year. The rest of it, these deaths are just part of the background. They're part of what we take as normal, and we don't do anything about it. So the question I'm asking now is, in this situation, is there a parallel here between our situation with regard to the children who are dying, or adults who are dying, because adults die as well from poverty-related causes? Is there a parallel between the child in the pond and our situation with regard to people in extreme poverty? It seems that to some extent there is a parallel. So here's some points of analogy. There's a child who dies, and we could have rescued that child at some modest cost to us. There are children who die, as I've said, and it seems plausible, I'm going to have to look at this more closely, but it at least seems plausible that there are things that we could do to help them. For example, as I said, we are already helping, we're making a difference, but with more resources we could expand immunisation against measles, we could provide more clean drinking water, we could distribute bed nets in places where malaria is rife, but they still don't have them. So at least it seems prima facie that there are things we could do, and that the cost of doing these things maybe is not all that different from the cost of replacing your expensive shoes or some other clothes, whatever it might be. And again, we can look in more detail at what those costs are. So that seems to be part of the parallel. Now, we know about this, of course. The children are not in front of us, but we know about this, or anyway, now you all know about it. And if you're not doing something to help, then are you in a similar situation to the person who didn't want to have the expense and inconvenience of saving the child and therefore walked on? So that's the case for saying there is a parallel here. There is some analogy between the two cases, and might be the case that what we are doing or not doing with respect to helping the global poor is not that different from the person who walks past the pond.